Formula One returned to Europe for the first time in 2022, and Imola was the destination. It certainly delivered. Mixed weather conditions, battles up and down the grid. A sensational weekend for Formula One overall. Let's talk about it though. From the beginning, let's talk about the fact it was a sprint weekend, the first sprint weekend we've seen this season, and many, many more to come with the new format and the new points. And genuinely, I thought it was a pretty entertaining sprint race. I think there are a couple of things going in its favour that we do have to talk about though, in the case that it was entertaining. First of all, the fact that the 2022 cars were able to follow each other a little bit better. That definitely does play into these sprint races being a little bit more entertaining. Still needed the DRS in my opinion. Without the DRS, I think it would have been a lot more boring, and I think we saw that in the race as well. The fact that there was no DRS in the first half of the Grand Prix really did lack that sort of impact for some of those teams. Secondarily, I think the mixed grid on Friday really did help. The fact that we had mixed weather conditions and red flags galore on Friday, breaking the record, 5 red flags in qualifying on Friday, and the fact that, your likes of Carlos Sainz, Sergio Perez, Valtteri Bottas were very much out of position as to where I expected them to be going into the sprint race meant that they really came alive in the sprint race, gave them an opportunity to make up for the fact that they had a disappointing Friday on the Saturday in preparation for the Sunday. But overall, a very good sprint race in my opinion, and genuinely, if they're a little bit more like that, I think they'll be very, very good going across the season. Now let's delve into Sunday, because it was Max Verstappen all the way to the bank. He was the showpiece for Formula One over the course of the weekend. Yes, I know Charles Leclerc got in front of him in the sprint race for the sort of 20 laps or so, but then Max Verstappen got back in front, started on pole position, and absolutely dominated this race on the Sunday. And I know we were talking about Charles Leclerc, the fact he was very impressive in Australia, getting that Grand Slam for Ferrari. Well, Max Verstappen just comes back and does one better. Not only a Grand Slam, but a sprint race victory in there as well. Jumps back up into second place in the rankings and is now barreling down on Charles Leclerc as much as he possibly can. Sergio Perez also looked in really impressive form over the course of the weekend for Red Bull. I think a much better step in the right direction for them. Clearly, they're trying to get on top of these issues they've had in the first 3 races. No DNFs for any of the Red Bull or the Red Bull Power Unit teams. So finally looking like they maybe are taking that step in the right direction. They're getting that consistency they want from that Red Bull car. And can they hunt down the Ferraris? Especially if the Ferraris have a poor weekend like they did in Imola, in front of the Tifosi, back in Italy. For the first time, it looked like a Ferrari might win in Italy and be dominant. And then suddenly Red Bull come and spoil the party. Charles Leclerc kind of spoiling the party for himself, though, towards the end of the Grand Prix. A 6th place finish for him overall. And he'll be very disappointed, I think, just because it's the first time we've seen him really under pressure in a race this far this season. You know, when the pressure was really on him to deliver. Yes, we've seen him battle with Max Verstappen, but I think it's a little bit more of a mental game. When you're stuck behind Sergio Perez, when you're clearly stuck behind the faster car, can you keep on delivering? And Charles Leclerc didn't quite have that edge to him, struggled a little bit, then went on the curb, spun it out. I thought honestly he was out of the race, but the fact he managed to clamber home a 6th position and still pick up points does bode well for that championship battle that he's going. You know, a DNF looks a lot worse than a 6th place at the end of the season when we look back at it, and whether him and Max Verstappen will be battling all the way to the end of the season for this title, definitely want to pick up as many points as you possibly can, even if that is just a 6th place when you hopefully would have gone on to get a 3rd place. And of course, the frustration continues for Carlos Sainz. What more can we say about Carlos Sainz? Just another weekend that didn't go his way. Really, really struggled in qualifying. Then obviously the mistake in Q2. Didn't get to take part in Q3. So started from 10th place in the sprint. Actually a very good sprint race from Carlos Sainz. Made up those positions. Got himself into 4th place. Looked like he might be able to battle with the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc and the Red Bulls in front of him. And then just gets into contact with Daniel Ricciardo. I think personally for me, it was more Daniel Ricciardo's fault, and that's more the frustration for Carlos Sainz. You know, again, it's him. And I'm not saying that, you know, Charles Leclerc is perfect, but it must be so frustrating for Carlos Sainz to seemingly be always the Ferrari where there's an issue, seemingly always be the Ferrari that is disappointed when it comes to the end of a race weekend. And it's another DNF for him, 2 DNFs in a row, and he's just going to get closer and closer to that bursting point that we've seen him get closer and closer to, where he isn't quite able to win that race in a Ferrari that definitely can win races, and he wants to get that first win under his belt. And I think that's the main thing for me. I think we've seen Max Verstappen, is now a world champion, has clearly done it before, battled right at the top, battled with Lewis Hamilton, one of the most exceptional drivers of our generation. We've seen Charles Leclerc, multiple race winner, now multiple races in a same season race winner as well, nearly getting back-to-back victories, getting 3 podiums in a row, could have been 4 podiums in a row in Imola as well. And Carlos Sainz is just there, not quite winning his first race, not quite getting up to that level, and I think that will start to show in his racing. At the other end of that, though, 2 very talented English drivers, and let's talk about Lando Norris to begin with. A great weekend for Lando Norris. Suddenly, McLaren look back in it again, and just look at this Constructors' Championship. McLaren consolidating 4th place for themselves and looking like they can stretch their legs a little bit, get away from 5th place and get themselves away from that midfield, and I think Lando Norris is absolutely fundamental to that. Looked really, really good. He said himself that he wasn't battling with the Red Bulls and Ferraris. Well, the Ferraris had problems, and Lando Norris was the man to pick up the pieces. And it felt like the Lando Norris of last year, the beginning of last year, before, it kind of tailed off towards the end of the season. But Lando Norris was always that best of the rest driver. He was always picking up those 4th places, those 3rd places, when people had problems, when the Mercedes and the Red Bulls were battling it out. Lando Norris was always kind of the man behind. And I think hopefully he'll slot into that position again over the course of this season, because best of the rest, and maybe even looking at Mercedes in 3rd place, a possible catch up to them. I'm not saying that it's doable. I'm not saying that, Mercedes won't improve over the course of the season, but McLaren need to set themselves some goals, and I think, dwindling to a 4th place maybe isn't for them. Maybe they can push it on. And then George Russell, of course, the other Briton who had an exceptional race in Imola, in my opinion, just continues to show his quality. And just no drama for George Russell, I think, is the main thing. First 3 races, been really, really good. Come into the Mercedes team, been a really level head, and has made just good points finishes look fairly effortless. Obviously was under a little bit of pressure from Valtteri Bottas towards the end of this race, and people's hearts started going when they saw George Russell and Valtteri Bottas on the same piece of track again at Imola. We know what happened last year, and whether or not George Russell was going to go and have to bop Bottas on the head again, we'd have to wait and see. But luckily, George Russell, cool, calm, collected, held on to that 4th place. I think was a little bit disappointed that he wasn't able to get that aero balance right. I think he would have liked to have had a go at Lando Norris for that podium, but George Russell overall very, very good. He keeps talking the good talk, keeps talking about how he's disappointed that he's not getting race wins at this moment in time, but genuinely I've been really impressed with George Russell over the start of this season. Once Mercedes get on top of those issues, I think George Russell could really cause a stir in those podium positions and possibly, really put himself amongst those Sergio Perez's, Carlos Sainz, even Leclerc's and Verstappen's towards the end of the season if Mercedes can really turn this around. Whereas obviously, at the other end of the spectrum, Lewis Hamilton having another tough weekend. Toto even apologising to Lewis Hamilton at the end of the race for a poor performance and a poor car over the course of the weekend. Even a little whisper of Lewis Hamilton asking for the cars to be swapped for him and George Russell. So, that is just a little bit of a whisper, not something that we've heard directly from Lewis Hamilton. Whether or not there's actually any inclination that that's true, we'll have to wait and see. But Lewis Hamilton really struggling over the course of the weekend. And then let's just very quickly touch on the midfield, because Alfa Romeo, Alpine, AlphaTauri, Haas, Aston Martin now also putting their hat in the ring. Alfa Romeo having a great race overall for Valtteri Bottas. Just looks revitalized, doesn't he? And just looks like a completely different driver now he's at Alfa Romeo. I think I personally was always one of those people that was a little bit disappointed for a little bit disappointed for Valtteri Bottas and not getting those race performances. He was always good in qualifying, but never quite got the race pace out of that Mercedes. Suddenly he's come to Alfa Romeo and he's one of the best racing drivers out there, just continually getting past people, flowing through the track and getting round the outside into turn 2 today, just with a little bit of DRS towards the end of the session as well. Nearly had a go at George Russell. Very, very impressed by Valtteri Bottas. Alpine had probably their worst weekend of the season. For me, it's really strange. Alpine seem like they've had a really good start to the season. Fernando Alonso seems like he's had a really good start to the season. 2 points for Fernando Alonso. Just seems very strange that he's still down there, and surely their luck is going to come better once Fernando Alonso starts picking up some points. Esteban Ocon, unfortunately, outside the points as well in Imola. Not quite the weekend he wanted. Obviously, qualifying didn't go his way. The sprint race wasn't great from him either, and then kind of got stuck in that train towards the end of the Grand Prix, did Esteban Ocon. So not quite the weekend that he would have wanted, but Alpine, I'm sure, will be back in full force towards the next couple of races. AlphaTauri, Yuki Tsunoda picking up some really good points, getting himself above Pierre Gasly in the rankings and having an overall good race. And Pierre Gasly obviously getting stuck behind Albon. Albon having a pretty good race for Williams as well, but just outside the points. There was lots of just not quite there points performances from lots of people. I think Albon could have probably broken into the points over the course of the weekend. Obviously had a really disappointing qualifying where his brakes just destroyed themselves inside the car, and then a really slow sprint race from Albon. Didn't quite make up the positions I think he would have wanted to, and therefore in the race had a little bit more to do. Did overall pretty good in the race though, Albon, I think, and yeah, on a different day, probably could have picked up some points. On a different weekend, probably will. Aston Martin, though, is the real talking point in the midfield. Like, the fact that they finally managed to get some points. They took advantage of the mixed weather conditions. They took advantage of other drivers having poor race weekends. You know, the fact that Mercedes was slow, the fact that Pierre Gasly looked really off the pace, did open the door for some other drivers to pick up some points, and Sebastian Vettel was the man there to pick up those points. Also, Alonso dropping out of the race, I think, obviously granted Stroll the ability to pick up his first point of the season, and the fact that Alfa Romeo and AlphaTauri did struggle a little bit with Joe and Gasly just gives Vettel that opportunity to jump up into 14th place, looking closer to Pierre Gasly, and suddenly Alfa Romeo under a little bit of pressure from the rest for 5th place. I genuinely think the mix for 5th place down to 9th place is all to play for. I don't think Williams are going to be in that fight towards the end of the season, but Haas, AlphaTauri, Alpine, Alfa Romeo all look very, very good, and Aston Martin could just put themselves in and amongst it. The final person I want to talk about is Mick Schumacher. I think probably a video coming on Mick Schumacher in the next couple of weeks or so, because he's in a very difficult position right about now. Kevin Magnussen with another great weekend for Haas. Like, let's not get it wrong. Kevin Magnussen has been phenomenal since he's come back into that Haas team and has picked up points continually. Obviously, Australia had a little bit of a blip, but that seems to just maybe Australia didn't suit the Haas car, because they were right back at it when they came to Imola, and I think we saw a similar thing with the Alfa Romeo. Just didn't quite suit the car, but now they're back at it again. Mick Schumacher, though, another mistake, another disappointing weekend, and it's 4 races now. He hasn't picked up the points. If you look at the drivers that have picked up points in front of him, you know, Albon's even picked up a point. Joe's a rookie, has picked up a point. Alonso's having the most unlucky season that I've seen from someone in a while, has picked up a couple of points, sorry. And Sebastian Vettel, Aston Martin, he's only been there for 2 races. He's picked up 4 points, and the Haas has looked really, really good, and Mick Schumacher just not able to get there, even starting in 10th place. Before the start of the race, I said that Mick Schumacher would probably go on to pick up his first points of the Formula One campaign this weekend, and it just didn't quite click. It didn't quite go his way, and I'm worried for Mick Schumacher. I think he's a really good driver, and I think, you know, 2021 was so disappointing for Haas and him, and it wasn't the season that we have wanted in his rookie debut in Formula One, and I'm just not quite sure where I sit on Mick Schumacher. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. Where do you see Mick Schumacher being? Because Carlos Sainz signing a 2-year extension. Doesn't look like he's going to be at Ferrari anytime soon. Haas are obviously aiming to get higher and higher up the table. And if they've got a driver that isn't going to deliver them points, you know, if we're looking at how close the Constructors' Championship is going to be, I'm already worried that Joe might let Alfa Romeo down. If Mick Schumacher is letting Haas down, that's another thing. You know, Joe's a rookie. Mick Schumacher's got a year of Formula One behind him. You'd expect maybe a little bit more from him. And I'd say Joe's probably had the better season of the two of them so far. So difficult to see where Mick Schumacher's going to end up at the end of the season, and difficult to see how he can really solve this problem. But as I said, I'd love to know your thoughts in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts on Imola. Did you enjoy the Grand Prix? Did you enjoy the sprint race format? Are you looking forward to more sprint races, or are you one of those people that's just like, no, let's go back to qualifying in the race only, please. Don't need sprint races in my weekend. Whilst you're commenting down there, leave a like, subscribe to the channel as well if you're new, and I will see you next time.